Does Canada suffer from a democratic deficit? I'm Jared Wesley from the University of Alberta, and we're going to get into that today on Fact or Fiction. Let's start by defining our terms. What is a democratic deficit? We hear it used all the time in media and elsewhere. Well, a democratic deficit exists to the extent that citizens' expectations of democracy are not being met. In other words, citizens have a set of expectations about the way that certain actors and institutions should perform, and they have perceptions about how well those institutions and actors are actually performing to that standard. So, as good political scientists, we need to look at both sides of the equation. Let's start with citizens' expectations. These will differ from individual to individual, as you might expect. Some people look to institutions like legislatures to provide descriptive or mirror representation. In other words, they expect that the legislatures will look like the communities that they're supposed to represent. They would expect that there would be an equal number of men and women. They might expect that there be an identical proportion of people from ethnic minority communities or people from indigenous communities in the legislature as they would appear in the general population. For others, substantive representation is more important. In other words, they would look to their legislators to deliver on the promises that they made during the campaign. So to the extent that different individuals look for different things in institutions like legislatures, we might expect that their expectations will be different as well. Those expectations are based on a whole host of factors. Some people are more informed about politics or better informed about politics than others. You can imagine a person who has spent their lives watching politics through an American politics lens might look at Canadian democracy quite differently than someone who didn't. In particular, they may look for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in our institutions, while others may look for peace, order, and good government. And we also can't ignore the extent to which different people have different lived experiences that then impact their expectations of the political system. You can imagine someone who has grown up in a family with multiple generations of residential school survivors might look at Canadian politics and institutions quite differently from someone who just immigrated here or from someone with no experience with residential schools whatsoever. In some cases, they may have heightened expectations for what democracy should look like in Canada. In other cases, they may have no expectations at all and may look to not be part of that system. But what about perceived performance? Well, those same factors, levels of knowledge, personal lived experience, different values, will also affect the way that people look at the performance of different institutions and politicians and other political actors in the system. Someone may look at BC Premier John Horgan as a fantastic representative because he delivers substantively on certain ideological or policy goals that that person shares with him. Other people may look at him and say, he doesn't look like me, he doesn't symbolize what I think our community should look like. And as a result, they're more likely to perceive a democratic deficit. So if expectations differ from person to person, how on earth do we measure something like a democratic deficit in Canada? A lot of people have used voter turnout as a shorthand indicator of the health of Canadian democracy. And to the extent that voter turnout, with the exception of the 2008 to 2015 period, has been relatively low compared to previous generations of Canadian politics, and to the extent that voter turnout in Canada is low compared to other Western democracies, people might see this as being an indication that people are not showing up because their expectations of the system are not being met. They're not showing up because they don't like what they're seeing. And a lot of reformers, for example, will point to the fact that Canada's first past the post system tends to generate a level of political cynicism among voters that is much higher than we would find in proportional representation system. More on that later in the course. But it's important to ask ourselves, does lower voter turnout actually mean that Canadian democracy is in trouble? To the extent that the non-voting population looks like the voting population, substantively we might have no problem at all. In other words, if the same types of people turn out to the polls as stay home on election day, then we might not have a problem at all. But we know that's not the case in Canada. And that's why I'd suggest that, at least in this aspect, low voter turnout might be an indication that Canada has a democratic deficit, because we do expect in a pluralist democracy like Canada that different groups of people will be able to participate equally in democratic outcomes. And we know that higher income individuals or people that are born in Canada are more likely to participate in elections than others. And we know that senior citizens are more likely than younger people historically to turn out at elections. And from rational choice theory, we know that politicians will then pursue those different groups of people that they know will turn out more often, pursue their votes, and as a result, their interests will be reflected in political discussions, discourses, and outcomes to a greater extent than people that don't show up. And to the extent that that's a problem to you, you might perceive there to be a democratic deficit in Canada. Others will look to high-level institutions like premiers or the Council of the Federation as an indicator of the health of Canadian democracy. And this is a picture taken from the 2019 Council of the Federation meeting, where we see all white people and only one woman. And from a descriptive representation standpoint, this would be problematic. It is a snapshot, however, and if we go back less than a decade, you would find that this family picture would have featured half women, half men, and if you go back even further, several more people from visible minority communities and Indigenous communities. So we have to also take into account the fact that measuring the democratic deficit should probably take place over a longer period of time rather than a simple snapshot in time. So it's not a really satisfying result, is it? Does Canada suffer from a democratic deficit? It really depends on the person or people that you're analyzing. They have very different sets of expectations and, I would suggest, very different perceptions of the performance of different political institutions.